everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. We're now wrapping up Pride Month, the American Ramadan, and as predicted this year, things have really toned down. It really seemed like the momentum had gone out of the sails of the Democrats with the win of Donald Trump and the number of states who seem to start pushing back a little bit against the whole pride madness, willing to use certain amounts of power. Governors like Ron DeSantis saying that ultimately we're going to start trying to push some of this out of the public square. Also, we've had major events like the immigration riots in LA and the war between Iran and Israel that have pushed Pride Month out of the front page, out of the spotlight, really put a damper on what's going on. But have we actually hit peak pride? Is this just a moment in a recession of kind of the value of pride? Or is it ultimately going to surge back? Or have we moved beyond it? Are we looking at a different paradigm that will kind of enter when it comes to the gender and sexuality wars the left likes to wage? Joining me today to talk about that is Scott Yenor. He is a professor over at Boise State, and he often contributes to the American Reformer magazine. Scott, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Auron. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So you wrote an interesting piece in the American Reformer here recently talking about how we might be past peak pride, but we shouldn't really count our ducks because there's still a possibility that a new and different form of the queering of America might become dominant. Can you lay out for a little bit why you think we might have moved beyond the pride movement as we currently understand it?
Yeah, so I want to spend a little time defining the Pride movement as we talk about this. So I'm in my mid 50s, and I think that my whole life there's been a big gay rights movement, but it's gone through phases. And the first phase of it was basically from when I was born, 1970 to 1990. It's the raunchy gay movement, and it was defined by the pride parades and all that stuff happened during this, but it was like designed to offend the sensibilities of Americans. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. Was one of the mottos of Queer Nation, which at the end of that time was a big gay rights group. And amazingly, Americans actually supported gay lifestyles less in 1990 than in 1970. And there's not this arc of progress or tolerance. There was they so offended the sensibilities of Americans that people had less support for gay rights in 1990 than they did in 1970. And the gay movement did a lot of self-reflection at that point. And the key to that self-reflection, I think, is a book called After the Ball, written by Kirk and Madsen, published in the late 80s, that said, look, the gay revolution has failed. And we need a new strategy to win acceptance for Americans. The subtitle of the book is, I've got to look it up so I don't get it wrong, How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 1990s. And the new strategy was no raunchiness. Take all of the weirdos, put them to the side, and we're going to center and platform a new kind of understanding, the pride understanding. Never talk about what gays do. Never show what gays do. Talk exclusively in terms of abstract concepts like dignity, equality, rights, autonomy, sexual freedom, and tolerance. And the pride movement has really been to center the normal bourgeois gay man and to sideline the weirdos that defined it in the 70s and 80s. They even, Kirk and Madsen even say something like, take all of the butch dykes, all of the mustachioed weirdos, don't put them out in the parades. Only put people with collared shirts who look like the boy next door in the parades. Don't touch one another. Don't hold hands. Just like this is an abstract idea. So the gay rights became more about, visitation rights in the hospital than about the things that gays do. And that movement, that pride movement, culminated in Obergefell, which is the same-sex marriage decision in 2015. And it was the public recognition of the autonomy, the dignity of homosexual relationships, and that was the public, that was the victory. And but the interesting thing happened is that Kirk and Madsen said that we're going to be able to win acceptance for gays if we follow this strategy of emphasizing abstract concepts of justice and not what gays do. But once we win, we will bring all of the weirdos back out and see if they can't be covered by the abstract concepts that won approval from the American people in Obergefell, apparently. And so almost immediately, I mean, the ink wasn't dry on Obergefell before what used to be called cross-dressers came out. And now they were people with new identities who needed to be affirmed and dignified in their new identities. And the transgendered became an issue. Out came the drag queens, the ones that Kirk and Madsen explicitly said, keep them out of the pride parades. Don't let people think that. That defines the movement. And all of these new but old approaches to gay rights were now centered, but they tried to wrap themselves up in the same language that the bourgeois gays were wrapped up in. And that has proven to be a very difficult thing to manage. That has proven to be a very difficult thing to hold together. And my thesis is that when you try to add the T to the LGB, it puts such strain on the dignity and autonomy argument that we are past peak pride because of the internal inconsistencies of the attempt to win public approval for same-sex marriage. It's more difficult to ship, like, say, pedophilia under the dignity autonomy argument that won the day in Obergefell. It's much more difficult to demand that boys, sit on the laps of sexualized men dressed up, or men dressed up as sexualized women, and tell them to go through drag queen story hour. So the internal inconsistency, which the left thought would help win approval for the transgendered and for the drag queens and for pedophiles, has ended up redounding to less popularity for same-sex marriage and the sexual liberation agenda than it has kind of the other way around. So I think that's kind of what we're living through. And so the Pride movement is a kind of victim of its own success. On the way up, they demanded message discipline. But now that they've won, the need for message discipline is no longer as profound, so they don't have message discipline. And the weirdos have come out of the closet and are now threatening to, and I think to some extent, actually defining the movement.
It's a fascinating transition because a lot of people will point to the Will and Grace Revolution, right? Where we have these, gays are just average people who are living, very fashionable lives. They're very relatable. There's nothing weird or strange about this. They're just entering, the gay marriage becomes the focus because that's what normal bourgeois people do when they're romantically involved. And so we're going to do this too. We even saw conservatives start to get on board with this, accepting a lot of gay marriage in, conservative commentary spheres or different leaders. Of course, you can buy children. That allows you to be a family like a normal family would be, right? This is kind of it's a little bit of a funhouse mirror, but if we look at it just right enough, then it kind of looks like an average American. But as you say, once that victory comes, then all of a sudden you start unspooling the discipline, the actual lifestyles, the fact that gay marriage is almost never monogamous, is almost always an open marriage, is always involving things that are, very off-putting to, I think, the average conservative if they looked below the surface. Once you start looking at what's involved with surrogacy, once you start seeing the drag queens show up, all of a sudden this kind of attempt to contain the gay movement and its extremes starts to break apart because they've won the argument. It's the end of history. You don't need to hide this stuff anymore. Now that you've gotten the Trojan horse in the gate, of course you can let everything out. But quickly people realized that they were sold something much different. And rather than allowing them to kind of justify everything after the fact, what happens is people are turning not just on the initial overreaches of pride, but they're even going back, and we're seeing approval for gay marriage plummet among many people, especially conservatives, very rapidly. And so we're seeing
Mhm.
that effect is very prominent and is undoing decades and decades of attempts to influence by the gay movement in just a few years.
Yeah, I mean, it was a real pivotal movement or moment in the early 1990s. And it's something that definitely in retrospect you can appreciate. Cultural watersheds like the movie Philadelphia, which starred Tom Hanks and Antonio Banderas. Tom Hanks was like a lawyer, and Antonio Banderas was his lover. And he was dying, Tom Hanks was dying of AIDS, and his firm was treating him badly because they knew he had AIDS, and therefore they knew he was gay in some way. And but they never touch in the movie, and we never see what Tom Hanks does in the movie. And he is just a competent person who ends up being treated badly by a series of homophobes who work in the particular law firm that he was in. And those homophobes end up being portrayed as like the villains of the movie, and Tom Hanks as a cultured bourgeois hero in the movie. And when you look at it now, it is such a timepiece. It is not something that is going to endure. I mean, it was such a piece of propaganda. And but there was a cultural watershed, just like the Will and Grace stuff. And it was, we have to admit, a very successful movement. I mean, the approval for same-sex marriage was almost zero when the movement started in 1990 toward this. And in 1993, when Philadelphia came out, I think the number is 63% of Americans thought that sex between people of the same sex was always wrong. That number is way lower now. And in part, that's because we're never going to see it on the screen. And Philadelphia and Will and Grace and all the other things, they are excellent examples of what this propaganda was supposed to do. But the key thing is that we're now in the third wave of gay rights. And that third wave of gay rights begins with the victory for gay marriage in Obergefell, where we take the raunchy reality of the first wave and try to wrap it up with the dignity, autonomy, and affirmation arguments of the second wave. And it's just that those two things end up not going so well together.
Right.
And the question will be, will conservatives now fight this third wave in the same way they fought the first wave? There were pretty successful public relations battles against gay rights in the 1970s. And it was done basically by emphasizing what they do, not responding to the dignity argument or the affirmation arguments of the pride movement, but rather just real sociology on what their life expectancy was. And I think something like that is necessary. And what's really interesting, when you read the gay literature of the 1970s, the great gay novels, the number one gay novel, in my opinion, is called Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran, written in the late 70s. There's always problems with the gay lifestyle. They always have psychological problems, physical problems that in that second wave are totally suppressed and are not allowed to be talked about by anyone, gay or straight. And so what I predict will happen is that it'll be intelligent for conservatives to begin to kind of return to what was done in the 70s, both by supporters of gay rights and those who opposed it, and talk about the reality as opposed to the abstract concepts.
Well, and I think we saw a lot of that actually recently with Glenn Greenwald. And to be clear, I've had Glenn on the show. I like a lot of the work that Glenn has done. But he's obviously someone who's very accomplished, very professional. It has made a lot of inroads with the right over the last few years of being a relatively principled left winger when it comes to free speech and many of the press and these
Mhm.
type of categories. However, when that sex tape came out, and all of a sudden conservatives were shocked. Yeah, what's going on here? My professional, well buttoned down guy who gay married somebody and adopted a bunch of kids, like all of a sudden he's dressing up as a woman, he's doing these degrading things on camera, he's doing hard drugs, and his argument is, well, this is my private life and you shouldn't be involved in it. It doesn't matter. And it felt like that argument might have worked 5 years ago, but it wasn't working now. A lot of people were looking at that and say, "No, man, like, you've got kids in the house, the
Mhm.
things you're doing are degrading. Like, this is not okay. This is not the soft pillow talk between two loving men that I was told was the core of the gay relationship. This is pretty wild stuff." And you get the feeling that this probably has been going on for quite a while. This is something that is a part of the lifestyle in general, and all of a sudden you realize that gay marriage is something very different than has been sold to you, and now children are being injected into this. And are you as a conservative really going to sit around and pretend like this is just none of your business? This is a guy who a lot of us respect, a lot of us look at what he's done and appreciate and have built those bridges, but at the same time, can you really turn a blind eye to this? And I think that's something that's probably only going to continue as it's harder and harder to kind of hold this will and grace image together.
Yeah, I think there'll be a temptation in this third wave of gay rights that we're in to merely go after the transgender issue, and which has obvious problems, and there's lots of public support for pushing back against it. And there'll be a temptation merely to say that drag queens should not be like teaching our kids in libraries, and to have the kids exempt from that kind of stuff. There'll be a temptation to just continue to say, like, pedophilia is bad, and we shouldn't advocate for that. We're not going to call them minor attracted persons, as has been tried, and not to like roll back more. And so I think the temptation needs to be resisted. And what that's going to mean in practice, I think, is that conservatives are going to have to like stop talking about the dignity argument, stop trying to battle same-sex marriage like conservatives did on the basis of trying to figure out what marriage is, as opposed to what people actually do and what should be supported by the public. And and so, instead of just trimming the edges of the latest role in the sexual revolution, I think this is actually a very unique opportunity to like go at the heart of that revolution. And I think the tape that you're talking about helps to do that. But there's also like studies that used to be done and commonly known, like what is the life expectancy of gays as opposed to straights. There was lots of work done on this in the 70s and the 80s. Like there's some work done on it now, but it's so propagandistic that it's hard to know exactly whether or not it's true. And so yeah, I think that digging in is the best strategy for helping to roll back some of the gains that have been made by the sexual liberation movement generally and the gay rights movement in particular.
Yeah, I guess I'm always a little skeptical that stats prove
Yeah.
anything. I've always been promised that like IQ research will overturn all these understandings of progressive, and it's like, no, no one cares. They just bury it and move on. The bell curve was many years ago, and we're still sitting around pretending like it never got written. But I do think that you're right that focusing on what actually happens, the visceral nature of the lifestyle, is very impactful. Whether the left likes it or not, most especially men have a disgust reflex that is
Yeah.
immediately triggered by this, and that I think that does impact them very much.
Yeah, I agree about the importance of statistics, but the question is like, what's the conservative narrative?
Sure.
We know what the left's narrative is on this, and they had a very clear one in After the Ball, and they had a strategy, and you can see them trying to expand it. Well, what's the conservative narrative? And the conservative narrative has to be something about this kind of life is a bad life. And this can be depicted obviously in art. It would be great if we had art that does that. We do kind of sometimes have art that does this on divorce, or at least we used to. And so any kind of statistic, I think, just has to be part of a broader narrative that we're basically for marriage between man and a woman being normative, and the things that aren't normative are like abnormative, and lead to less good lives. And so, yeah, I totally agree that stats alone don't do anything, but like knowing what the end is and then having a story that helps you get to that end, I think is not unimportant when it comes to like rollback.
So a big part of this, obviously, this acceptance for better or for worse in the United States is corporations. They have a large impact on our culture. They have a large impact on what we see, what's celebrated, what media is created, what gets taught, these kind of things. And one of the big victories, I think, ultimately of the gay movement was to attract corporate sponsorship, to make woke capital part of the narrative. This is something that your employer is celebrating. This is something that gets favored in hiring. This is something that seems a positive on your resume as part of the woke stack as to whether or not you get picked
Mhm.
up. Obviously, the pride version of the gay movement was a big win in this area because it cleaned up the image enough to allow the stuff to get inserted into the corporate infrastructure. As we've watched the pushing of this, you got as it always happens, the activists come in, they start to change the culture in the corporation, it gets
Mhm.
selected for, all of a sudden the family friendliness falls away because the activists are in control and they're pushing ideology over the well-being of the corporation. We're getting classic conquest laws breakdowns here in
Mhm.
complex organizations, but we kind of started hitting a wall with this. The real pushback started. I think Bud Light was the strangest example that I've ever seen because for many, I mean, I remember my parents boycotting Disney when they approved gay benefits in the 90s, right? Like this
Mhm.
has been going on forever. And none of those boycotts ever mattered. They never did anything. None of it stopped it. But for some reason, that one caught hold. And I think it is because the transgender stuff is so egregious. It was very easy for the social pressure to suddenly flip on Bud Light. And that started a cascade, I think, for corporations to recognize that there is actually a line that's too far in when it comes to gay rights. We can lose money on this. This is not something that we can just push forever with no consequence. And so obviously the radicalization is starting to encourage the corporations to dial down. But do you think that's a permanent thing? Do you think corporations will ultimately walk away from this celebration? Will they shift their support, change the names? What do you think will happen with the corporate interaction here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the premise that it was basically corporate America that gave us same-sex marriage, and the state pitched in, but it was definitely a corporate elite movement. This is very well established. They were always way out ahead of the public on these matters, and I also agree with the analysis that we have now, which is that part of the passing of peak pride is that corporate sponsors all over the country have pulled out pride parades, pride months, pride festival. Here in Boise, a lot of events were canceled. The organizer of the pride festival complained that there was only 3 really steady corporate donors for it: Micron, Albertsons, and Fred Meyer. And 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 there's obviously a recognition that not only it might be bad for business, and of course the reason it might be bad for business is that there's more people interested in organizing against it. There's more people interested in boycotting it, so that the lack of corporate support really reflects some change in public opinion and some radicalization in public opinion, where a few people are organizing against corporations, others are following, but it's enough for them to worry about their bad press. And so now many corporations, Target is the one I think about in this. I think they're one of the first. They had like the tucked underwear or something like
Yeah.
this, and they're now actually worried about their right instead of only being worried about their left, and that is an advance. So, how permanent are those changes? Well, to me, that question kind of comes down to is how permanent is the opposition to the third wave, and and I think in America the opposition has remained steady at a particular level, much higher than every other country. About a third of Americans are just simply unreconciled to the same-sex marriage regime. And that number has been steady since it happened. I mean, it's gone up and down a little bit, but it's remained very steady. A little more than that number remain opposed to the idea that sex between those of the same sex is always moral. So unlike Europe, where those numbers are like trending with the arc of history bending toward tolerance, in America, we've hit a point where it doesn't seem to be changing and moving. And there's even some signs of rollback in public opinion. So I think and I think this ends up being very much connected to the whole opposition to the woke regime and DEI in higher education, because people are sick of the propaganda and they've seen through it, either through COVID or for the BLM riots. Thanks to Elon's acquisition of Twitter, there's ways of exposing propaganda and seeing that you're not alone. And so and when you look at it as opposition to propaganda, you can look back and see a longer arc of suspicion, dating probably from the beginning of the gay rights movement in the 70s, where people distrust institutions, they distrust the media. And eventually this stuff spills over into everything that government officials and the media and corporate elites say. So I think it looks to be something that is enduring. And I also think that it looks to be something that's spreading to other countries. That is, this opposition to propaganda. It seems to me that when you look at that second wave of gay rights, what their goal is to end all denunciations of gays and their lifestyles. And if you say something bad, you're like a persona non grata. And that requires increasingly, especially when you extend it to transgenders or drag queens or pedophiles, it requires like getting a grip on free speech. And the more people recognize that, the more they're going to oppose the censorship and all the causes that it serves. And so what I see happening in the West generally is like rejecting the propaganda regime. And it now, like when it's seen as propaganda, it ends up being, even though I may not care about this issue, I'm going to act like I care about it because I'm sick of propaganda. And that, to me, it strikes me as sustainable for a while until some sort of alternative propaganda arises, alternative memes that would define a new movement. I think some of that is happening. So I think that variable, the importance of propaganda, is something we cannot underestimate, and we should see that as really part of the passing of pride, is the passing of pride propaganda.
Yeah, and you're right that the cancellation of anybody who brings forward any questions was critical, and you have to have this basically totalitarian level of control of media and discourse, because honestly, if you let many of these activists talk long enough, even if they're very high in message discipline, they're eventually going to admit that like pederasty is a pretty big part of male homosexuality and always has been, and that's actually what generates the relationship, which is why you see, despite the attempts for message discipline, there's always this push to kind of lower an age of consent or remove laws between men and boys. And, by certain activists, you look at the lesbian domestic violence rate or the level at which they get pregnant, despite that not being a function of a lesbian relationship. And you really see that a lot of this breaks down pretty quickly. And so I guess that means, does ultimately the movement shift to embrace the weird? Because as you point out, this was always a defining lifestyle, and you can always feel that undercurrent. This, we're well buttoned up gay married gays, but remember the Stonewall riots, right? Like there's always this desire to go back to the recognition of this as some underground deviant lifestyle, because that's the reason they're in it in the first place. That's that's the actual allure of it, not your ability to be a buttoned up member contributing to society. There are a few people who ultimately bought that propaganda, I think, and tried to force themselves into that box, but it only lasts so long. And so now we see that a lot of people, even those who are supposed to be like somewhat involved in Islamic culture, like the new guy who's supposed to be, probably the shoe-in for mayor in New York, talking about how like violence against trans people calls for the end of policing and these kind of things. That rhetoric just becomes unavoidable. And do you think ultimately that will be what they embrace, that they're going to go all in on the more radical version of this because they simply can't get back to the controlled pride narrative that used to be central to its advancement?
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second, because I look at that as a great way of illustrating these three waves of gay rights. Um, so the first wave of gay rights was, I'll say, like open and honest about what gay rights would mean, and even to the point where they established a group. It was called NAMBLA, the North American
Right.
Man Boy Love Association, in response to like school districts not hiring gay teachers. Like they were out in the open about what they were going to try to accomplish. And when Kirk and Madsen wrote their book, they're like, well, like we have problems here. We don't want to, like, NAMBLA is no longer invited to the gay pride parades. Like, but this is part of the overall lifestyle. And we think that there should be some moral reform here. We wish that you'd go after boys less than you do now. Um, our PR problem will be solved if you like fix the underlying problem, and at least don't present it in public, and don't celebrate it in public, but maybe do it less often. And that was the second wave. And then once they win, I mean, what happens? The raunch comes back, but it's relabeled as minor attracted persons, people who have inclinations that need to be affirmed or at least identified. And uh, and so it's very difficult to kind of win people over with that argument. And just like NAMBLA turned people off in the 70s and 80s, trying to wrap up minor attracted persons with the language of pride and affirmation ends up redounding to the discredit of pride affirmation, and to the mockery of those who call themselves minor attracted persons. So I do think that it's a nice way of illustrating how each of the waves proceeds, and why there's a kind of incoherence or instability in that third wave.
Do you think ultimately there is a will inside conservatism to shift on this? Because I do feel, the very sad truth is that for many conservatives, once the left wins a battle, it's just not worth going back and touching that third rail once it's been, electrocuted, basically. And so you have this. Again, it was very clear that for a while the conservative movement said, okay, gay marriage is legalized and that's just going to be the law of the land. And so the question is not, do we push back, but how do we integrate this into our larger movement? And it's Trump waving the LGBT flag. It's putting, well-polished gay men in, high-level cabinet positions, these kind of things. We're going to find, we want the gays who are having families and well spoken and cleaning up their act. But that seems to have started to fall apart a little bit, and that's giving I've seen some panic in, what do we say, are the more moderate
Mhm.
conservatives, those that tend to be more mainstream, or maybe are refugees from the left. Many of the IDW types, the I didn't leave the left left me
Mhm.
types. They were comfortable moving over to the conservative side of things because they thought this issue was solved. Right? We've already got gay marriage. It's already happening. The conservatives are never rolling this back. So it's okay for some of us to move a little bit to the right, because ultimately they're never going to touch our core issue again. And so we can go for less taxes, or, being less radical on college admissions for race or something. But ultimately, like, we know gay marriage is safe and that's never going to get moved. And this is never going to bite us for moving back over.
Yeah.
Now they're seeing that pushback a little bit and they're getting pretty uncomfortable. You can also see many of the mainstream outlets like Fox News seem to want to kind of dial back any discussion about whether we should be addressing that issue or not. Do you think conservatives are ready to revisit that? We've talked about their tactics, but
Yeah.
ultimately, do you think the will exists there, or do you think it's too deeply seated for them to really push back at this point?
Yeah, and that's why I think the third wave insight is an important insight. So let me do the three waves in a different way and try to answer that question. So, what
Sure.
is the first wave about? The first wave is about liberation from social constraints. Like the first wave is against the family, like the gay rights movement, the founding documents. They say things like heterosexuality is effed up, and especially when it points toward marriage. And and it's informed by these sexual liberation theories of Marcuse and all these other guys. And so the analysis that they had was, we're going to try to deconstruct the restraints of society so that we have genuine sexual liberation, which is why it wasn't just gays who had to be liberated, but also all of the weirdos. And so they centered the weirdos because the goal was to say no constraints. Well, the second wave said, well, that didn't work. Like, we didn't actually get rid of the constraints. What we need to do is remake those constraints. And we're going to remake them so that they include a select few among this coalition that used to be all raunchy. And it's going to culminate in same-sex marriage. In the first wave, no one wanted to serve in the military because the military was a fascistic institution. In the second wave, gays in the military. Like, we want to remake the bonds of the nation and redefine patriotism so that it includes gays. So now, what do we have in this third wave? Where we have the get rid of all constraints crowd trying to wrap themselves up in the language of affirmation. And I don't think that a civilization can be built on that basis. I don't think that, I mean, what it's doing is putting the lie to the contention that it had modest ambition. The movement had modest ambitions, and now it's showing that the ambitions are actually endless and aiming at the heart of civilized institutions. So my hope is that necessity will be the mother of invention here. That conservatives actually can't fight this stuff without revisiting some of the things that happened in the past, some of the parts of the seeming consensus that existed, because the consensus itself has been exposed as entirely unstable and unsuitable for a civilized country. And so whether the need, I think the need is there, whether there'll be like politicians who rise to the occasion is actually starting to happen to some extent. I live in Idaho, and our legislature, at least, has put forward a letter asking the Supreme Court to revisit Obergefell. I think other states have followed suit, but I can't name them off the top of my head. And so I think things like that are going to 5 years ago, there was no appetite for any of that stuff. And in fact, people who supported it would have been like laughed out of public life. And now, like, people who didn't support it are going to have problems in primaries, at least in this particular state. And I think it could be true of other states as well. So, yeah, I think it's entirely possible that there will be pushback and rollback designs on the right because of what's at stake in this particular wave.
Well, there's also a sense in which victory begets victory. A lot of people would look at something like Roe versus Wade. It was untouchable. It's the law of the land. It's this monolith that just will always be the case, and you have to plan your politics around it because it's just untouchable. And any attempt to actually reach it is going to destroy your coalition, destroy your political movement. And it turns out, actually, no. You can, the Supreme Court can revisit it. They can successfully repeal it, or overturn it, and actually a Republican president can turn around and still win an election. We were told over and over again that the overturning of Roe versus Wade was going to be the death knell for the Trump campaign. It's going to be impossible for Trump to win, given these political realities, and yet that's not the case. Not only does he win, he gets this landslide victory, both houses of Congress. All of these things fall in his lap. And so those arguments start to fall apart when you see the Bud Light victory, when you see the Roe victory. These things are not just done questions. And so that argument of, well, we just can't touch gay marriage, we just can't address it. This is something that can never be overcome. Political reality, move on and start talking about low taxes or something. That doesn't fly anymore because conservatives have tasted victories in these areas. They recognize that there is a winning formula. There is a way to address this. And so they're going to start demanding their politicians take those actions because the idea that this is just an untouchable issue or unwinnable issue simply does not sell to the base anymore. And they're going to desire more action, especially again when we see politicians like Ron DeSantis act more aggressively in this area. So it's not even always at the federal level. Like there are things that my state legislature can do. There are things my governor can do. There are things that even my mayor can do to change the way that we're addressing this. And so your excuse of, oh, well, this is just the way politics is at this point, it starts to come apart.
Yeah, I mean, I look at several things that seem to be untouchable, like no fault divorce. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine growing any kind of sustainable marriage culture when you have no fault divorce, at will divorce, as the basic law of the land. I know states set the law, but almost every state has the same kind of thing. So that really just inherently at the heart of the institution takes away its enduring character, or at least qualifies its enduring character. And so, that happened in the early 70s. It's like as I say, impossible to see a victory for a pro-family culture that doesn't on some level revisit that decision. Right. And the consequences of not revisiting it are becoming more manifest as time goes on, I think. And I put same-sex marriage, I think same-sex marriage is a lesser issue than no-fault divorce in total. But that doesn't mean it's unimportant. I think no-fault divorce is a 10 on the Richter scale when it comes to how it affects family life, and same-sex marriage is just less than 10.
Yeah, I mean, by definition, it's going to affect more people and specifically more families than gay marriage ever would.
Yes, I think that's right. And I mean, gay marriage does end up, changing the nature of procreation in the law, and, has a kind of creeping effect too. But, so I think like these things are going to ultimately have to be revisited. And I think there's more of an appetite every year among at least conservative think tanks to go after these things than there was certainly in 2015-16 when I worked in DC. Talking about rolling back no fault divorce or even proposing something against that would have been definitely off the table at any kind of conventional think tank. These things are on the table because the situation is worse. And so putting them on the table is going to be actually part of it. That's what I mean. Necessity is the mother of invention in this matter. And the needs of this time really are calling us forth to revisit our first principles, and more of that is happening.
Yeah, as you get pushed closer to the edge of the cliff, the necessity of figuring out how to avoid it opens up all kinds of new possibilities. Yeah, that's
no doubt, no doubt. And I do think that the interesting thing about how this affects churches, if I could just maybe conclude with this, is that
absolutely.
It seems that many churches are about 10 years behind on this. They're still living in the pride universe and are trying to speak the language of welcoming and affirmation that came along with the pride agenda. And so I think the political movement is actually in front of the religious movement, even though that's more important religiously to oppose these things than it is politically, I think, because it's so close to the heart of the institutions. And so my hope is that the churches will catch up and recognize what is going on culturally and become leaders in this area again.
Yeah, very sad that even as the kind of pushback, I think, against the radical progressive revolution has suddenly caught on culturally, the American church, as in so many cases, is lagging behind quite desperately and could really do with a very quick return to reality here. And I hope you're ultimately right that accelerates. But guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Of course, I want to thank Scott for coming on. Sorry, I should have said this at the beginning, but this is a pre-taped episode, so we won't be able to take any audience questions. I'll make sure to throw that at the beginning of the episode when it goes live. But it's been great speaking with you, Scott. Is there anything that you want to direct people towards, your writing, books, anything you want people to know about?
Well, I wrote a book in 2020 called The Recovery of Family Life. I'm not that active on Twitter personally, but I usually put everything I write up on my Twitter account. So if you're interested in things I write, I'll have more articles in this vein and a bunch of more on feminism coming out. You might take a look at my Twitter feed.
Excellent. Well, like I said, make sure to check out Scott's work. And if it's your first time on this channel, make sure to click subscribe on YouTube, the bell and notifications so you know when our streams go live. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you do, please leave a rating or review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.